On July 5th, 1852, Frederick Douglass rose to speak in Corinthian Hall in Rochester, New York. The date was his own choosing. The Ladies Anti-Slavery Society had invited him to speak on the 4th, the nation's birthday, the day of parades and bells and public readings of the Declaration. He declined the 4th. He spoke on the 5th. Before he said a word about slavery, the calendar had already made his argument. This was their day of freedom, and he would speak from just outside it. He had been at this a long time by then, 14 years out of bondage, years of lecturing, of publishing his own newspaper, of standing in front of crowds who came to be moved and went home unchanged. And through all of it, he had watched the country argue itself toward exhaustion over slavery, the fights over the territories taken from Mexico, the threats of disunion from both directions, and then 2 years earlier, watched it declare the argument finished. Something in Douglass had worn through by then, not his conviction. That never bent. It was his tolerance for being heard and changing nothing. A country had listened to him, read him, applauded him, and kept walking in the same direction regardless. So when they handed him the platform on the one day the nation felt proudest of itself, he took it, not to stand beside them in celebration, but to finally lay down in full everything he had been carrying in silence. To understand what Douglass walked into, you have to feel the mood of the country in 1852, and it was not the mood we might expect. The needle was not pointing toward tension or toward any sense that a reckoning was coming. It was pinned to relief. 2 years earlier, the Compromise of 1850 had been marketed as the final permanent resolution, the settlement that would put the whole dangerous question to rest, and the country seized it gratefully. The political parties, Democrat and Whig alike, campaigned on a single promise: finality. From the pulpits, the clergy preached reconciliation rather than confrontation, peace over agitation, healing over argument. For free black families in the northern states, it brought something else. The settlement of 1850 had come with a law that reached into every free city in the country. Men and women who lived in free states could be seized on the street and sent south before their neighbors knew they were missing, while northern pulpits preached that obedience to the law was a Christian duty. The country wanted to talk about railroads, new territory, and business. A nation that had spent years living at the edge of its own dissolution had been handed permission to look away, and it took that permission with both hands. That is the room Douglass stood in, not a country bracing for a storm, but one congratulating itself on having escaped one, tired, grateful, wanting to believe the fever had broken, and deeply unwilling to be told otherwise. We tend to picture the South of the 1850s as a doomed region, anxious, backward, already sensing that history had turned against it. In 1852, that picture would have been unrecognizable to the people living it. The South was not bracing for anything. It was ascendant. Cotton prices were strong. The plantation frontier was pushing steadily westward into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, opening new ground for the crop that fed the mills of the North and of England. And by the reckoning of the ledgers, the enslaved people who worked that ground had become the single most valuable category of property in the United States. It is worth pausing on what that means. Not the most valuable in the South in the country, worth more than every factory, every railroad, and every bank in America combined. There was no larger holding on the national balance sheet than human beings. To keep that frontier growing, those human beings were moved in enormous numbers. The internal slave trade, the Second Middle Passage, carried roughly 1 million men, women, and children from the worn-out fields of the Upper South into the cotton lands of the Deep South. Families were broken to feed the demand for labor. This was not a dying institution winding down. It was a growing one, expanding at the very moment it felt most secure. The country was being asked to examine itself. It chose instead to protect its fortune. The fortune did not stay in the South. Northern banks financed the plantations that produced it. Northern ships carried the cotton to the mills of New England and Liverpool. Northern merchants, insurers, and brokers took their share at every step along the way. The money moved north, and it moved constantly. But the story the North told itself was a story about geography. Slavery was a Southern institution, something that happened below a line on the map. Regrettable, certainly. Distant, absolutely. And not the North's to answer for. Douglass built his speech to take that story apart, because the North was not a bystander to the arrangement. It was load-bearing. Its banks held the paper. Its courts enforced the claims. Federal judges in free states empowered to return a person to bondage. Its citizens were required by law to assist in the capture, and its congregations blessed the whole of it, draping the arrangement in the language of order and peace. And here is the force of it. No single one of those supports could survive being named. The banks alone convict the North. The courts alone convict it. The churches alone, the citizens alone. Each one by itself ties the North to the institution and leaves no honest claim to distance. Douglass named them all. One by one, he closed off every avenue of escape until his listeners were left holding the one thing they had come there certain they did not have: guilty hands. This is why the speech cuts the way it does. It is not a Southern indictment delivered safely to a Northern audience. It is a national one. The Fugitive Slave Act was enacted in September as a central component of the Compromise of 1850, tightening federal requirements for the capture and return of enslaved people who escaped to free states. It began by removing the accused person's voice. A man or woman claimed as a fugitive could not testify. They could not answer the claim, correct the record, or state their own name in their own defense. Someone else swore they were property, and the matter proceeded from there. The case did not go before a jury. It went to a federal commissioner appointed for the purpose. There was no jury. There was no appeal. The commissioner was paid by the case. $10 when he ruled that the person before him was a slave, $5 when he ruled that they were free. The difference was written into the statute in plain language for any clerk to read. The law reached past the courtroom as well. It required ordinary citizens to assist federal marshals when called upon. Aiding a person who had escaped or interfering with a capture carried a fine of up to $1,000 and up to 6 months in jail. And it applied everywhere: Massachusetts, Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania, every state, free or slave. There was no longer any ground in the country where a person who had escaped could stand and be free. The law did not go unanswered. In March of 1852, a woman living in Maine published a novel written in direct response to it. By that summer, Uncle Tom's Cabin was the best-selling book in America. 300,000 copies in its first year, in a country of 23 million people. Slavery was no secret. The country had argued it in Congress, counted it in the census, and read about it in the papers for 50 years. What it had never done was look at what the institution did to the people inside it. What matters here is not the story it told. What matters is that it was read. For the first time, the argument over slavery arrived in ordinary American households without passing through a party newspaper or a pulpit. The two institutions that had spent 2 years explaining why the question was closed. Stowe went around them, and the country bought her book faster than it had ever bought a book. So consider the year Douglass was standing in. An election being fought on the promise that the question was finished. A runaway bestseller proving that it was not. A nation trying to hold both of those facts at the same time. He knew his audience had read it, which meant he did not need to make them feel anything. Stowe had already done that. He needed to make them act. Sympathy asks only that you feel something. Obligation asks that you do something. That was the distance he set out to close. The room Douglass spoke to was standing on ground that was giving way. Many in that hall were Whigs, and their party was in its final year as a national force. Northern Whigs were drifting toward anti-slavery. Southern Whigs were defending slavery to hold the Union together. The weight in the middle was the same question everyone had agreed was settled, and it was splitting the party in half. These were people losing their political home, and people who lose their political home listen differently. They were available to an argument they would have refused 5 years earlier. And there was another kind of political awareness in the country that year, one almost never counted. Enslaved people in the Upper South, in Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, the Carolinas, were not sealed off from national life. Information moved constantly through channels the people who owned them barely registered. Watermen working the rivers, teamsters on the roads, domestic servants standing silently in dining rooms while politics was argued over dinner, congregations gathering on Sundays. News traveled, and it was read with the attention of people whose survival depended on reading the country correctly. They followed the fights over territory. They understood what a compromise was and what it was not, and they had reached their own conclusion about how it would end. So when Douglass declared that the system could not hold, he was not delivering that certainty to people who lacked it. Their conviction was older than any speech he could give. Some of the hardest words Douglass spoke that day were aimed not at slaveholders or politicians, but at the church. That was strategy. Slavery in America did not rest on law and money alone. Its firmest foundation was moral, and that foundation had been built deliberately. For 2 decades, Southern divines had been assembling an entire theology, arguing that slavery was not a regrettable inheritance, but a divinely ordained social order, sanctioned by Scripture and pleasing to God. The project reached in both directions. Missionaries were sent onto the plantations with prepared religious lessons teaching enslaved people that obedience was Christian duty, and with matching instruction for masters and overseers about their own sacred obligations in return, a theology written for both ends of the whip. The strain had already broken the churches themselves. The Methodists split north and south in 1844, the Baptists in 1845. The largest denominations in America could not hold together over the question years before the country faced it. This was the shield Douglass set out to break. A church that preached salvation and redemption while staying silent about slavery had not simply failed. It had taken the side of the owner and called that holy. To leave that sanction standing was to spare the root, so he named the holiest authority in the land as slavery's most essential accomplice. At one point, the speech turns toward hope. But to understand why, you have to understand a fight that was tearing the anti-slavery movement apart from the inside. The question was the Constitution. To one side stood William Lloyd Garrison, Douglass's own mentor, the man who had first put him on a stage in most of the abolitionist mainstream. To them, the Constitution was a pro-slavery bargain, corrupt beyond repair, a covenant with death. A nation founded on such a document could not be reformed. It should be abandoned. They would not vote, hold office, or touch a system they had judged illegitimate. It was a position of real moral clarity. It was also a decision to leave the field. Douglass had come to see what that cost. Withdraw from politics and you surrender the only ground on which slavery could actually be ended. In a country where the vote had just been extended to nearly every white man in it. So he broke with his mentor. He argued that the founding charter, read as it was meant to be read, contained the instruments of slavery's own destruction. The fault was not in the nation's principles. The fault was in a nation refusing to honor them. And that gave him something no uprising against bondage on this continent had ever had. A standard the country had written for itself in its own hand that it could be held to. He did not have to invent the case against slavery. America had already made it and then declined to mean it. Set the two pictures side by side, what the country believed in 1852 and what Douglass forced into the light. The distance between them is the whole speech. The illusion held that the South was doomed and anxious. a region sliding toward its own collapse. The exposure showed it wealthy, ascendant, expanding, holding the most valuable property in the United States, and certain that time was on its side. The illusion held that the North was innocent, kept clean by distance. The exposure named it the financier and the enforcer. Its banks held the paper. Its courts returned the accused. Its citizens were deputized by law. The illusion held that the Compromise of 1850 had settled the matter. The exposure showed the Fugitive Slave Act erasing free soil altogether and turning the streets of Rochester into ground where a neighbor might vanish. And the illusion held that the church was a source of holy reconciliation. The exposure revealed the moral shield built deliberately over 20 years by men who knew exactly what they were building. This is what Douglass did across the length of the address. He took every comfort the nation reached for and turned it over to show what was written on the underside. The country had not answered the question. It had agreed together to stop asking it. Strip the speech to its frame, and what remains is an indictment in 7 counts. Douglass did not shout them. He set them down the way a man reads items from a ledger. The first 3 go to the foundations. Your founding principles say that all men are created equal. 3 million people were held as property. Your laws are written to secure justice. The newest of them denied a man the right to speak in his own defense and paid the officer twice as much to send him south as to set him free. Your religion says to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Its missionaries carried lessons onto the plantations, teaching the enslaved that obedience was Christian duty. The next 2 take what the country holds up and turn it around. Your 4th of July honors liberty. For 3 million people inside your borders, it is a day of mourning. Your Constitution, you have been told, protects slavery. Read honestly. It contains the instruments of its destruction. And the last 2 are not about the past at all. You believe the matter is settled. Nothing has been settled. The fortune is still growing. The law is still in force. Your future depends on reopening the question you have told yourselves is closed. And what that requires is already in your hands. Not revolt and not rescue from somewhere else. The ballot. Not one of these asked to be taken on faith. The statute books were public. The church minutes were a matter of record. The declaration was hanging on the wall. He was not asking to be believed. He was asking to be checked. What Douglass did was harder than prophecy. The country had just spent 2 years telling itself the question was settled. He stood in front of his own allies and refused to let that closure hold. He read the Declaration back to a nation that had stopped listening to its own words, and it did not end in that hall. The address was printed and carried out into a country that had just tried to bury the argument. No single voice turned the country, and Douglass never suggested one could, but 1852 refused to stay quiet. A novel outsold every book in America. An election ran on a promise the country could not stop arguing about. Among free black communities in the North, that address did not need to change the nation's mind to matter. It put on the public record what those communities had been living without a platform to say, and it argued that the instruments of the country's own founding could be turned against the thing they were being used to protect. What followed was not immediate. It took years, and it took other hands. But the question he refused to let close did not close. 4 years later, in 1856, a political party that had not existed when Douglass took that stage ran a candidate for president on a single issue, stopping the spread of slavery, and came close enough that no one could pretend the matter was settled any longer. He did not force that door open by himself, and he never claimed he could. What he made certain was that it could not be quietly locked again. Thank you for watching. If you found this information valuable, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue documenting these stories and making these resources accessible to a wider audience. We'll see you in the next video.